When power meets courage, everything changes. Ronald Blackwell ruled through fear until one waitress dared to expose the truth. What happened next shocked everyone and changed countless lives forever. The crystal chandeliers of Le Grand Palais restaurant cast their golden light across marble floors that had witnessed countless business deals, political conspiracies, and the casual destruction of lives. But tonight, those same floors would bear witness to something unprecedented, the humbling of a man who had forgotten what it meant to be human. Ronald Blackwell adjusted his platinum cufflinks as he surveyed his kingdom from the corner booth that had been permanently reserved for him every evening for the past decade. At 52, he commanded an empire worth $12 billion, but more intoxicating than his wealth was the absolute power it gave him to crush anyone who dared to breathe the same air as his superiority. His eyes swept across the restaurant with the predatory satisfaction of an apex predator surveying prey. Every waiter who passed his table moved with the nervous energy of servants who knew their livelihoods depended on his fleeting approval. Every patron who recognized him quickly averted their gaze, understanding instinctively that direct eye contact with Ronald Blackwell was a privilege they hadn't earned. Mr. Blackwell, Frank Morrison, the restaurant manager, approached with the careful deference of someone who had learned through painful experience that a single word could end careers. Your usual table is prepared, and Chef Philippe has personally selected tonight's menu for your approval. Ronald didn't acknowledge Frank's presence with so much as a glance. To him, service staff were merely extensions of the furniture, functional objects that existed solely to facilitate his comfort. The fact that Frank had a mortgage, 3 children, and a wife battling illness was as irrelevant to Ronald as the weather patterns on distant planets. "Where's my regular server?" Ronald finally spoke, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to treating human beings as disposable commodities. "I specifically requested that nobody new would attend to my table." Frank's face flushed with nervous perspiration. "Sir, Maria had to leave unexpectedly. Her son was involved in an accident and she needed to get to the hospital. We've assigned Elena Rodriguez to your table tonight. She's one of our most experienced servers." "I don't care about Maria's family drama," Ronald replied with ice-cold indifference. "I care about consistency in my service. If your staff can't manage their personal lives well enough to maintain professional commitments, perhaps they should find employment better suited to their limitations." The words hit Frank like physical blows. Maria had been with the restaurant for 8 years, had never missed a shift, and was beloved by both staff and customers. But Frank knew that expressing any of this to Ronald would result in consequences that could destroy not just his own career, but potentially the jobs of everyone in the restaurant. "Of course, Mr. Blackwell. Elena is exceptionally qualified and will ensure your evening exceeds expectations." Ronald's laugh was devoid of any warmth or humanity. "Let's hope so, because if tonight's service disappoints me, I'll make sure my displeasure is reflected in ways that extend far beyond this establishment." The threat hung in the air like toxic gas. Everyone within earshot understood its implications. Ronald Blackwell didn't just ruin individual careers. He destroyed entire businesses with the casual ease of someone swatting flies. His influence extended through city councils, health departments, licensing boards, and financial institutions. Cross Ronald Blackwell, and you might find yourself unemployed, evicted, and blacklisted from an entire industry. Elena Rodriguez emerged from the kitchen carrying a water pitcher, unaware that she was walking into a situation that would test every principle she had ever held dear. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had fought for everything she had achieved. By day, she was pursuing her law degree at Metropolitan University. By night, she worked at Le Grand Palais to pay for tuition and support her younger brother's medical treatments. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwell," Elena said with professional courtesy as she approached his table. "I'm Elena, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." Ronald looked up from his phone with the expression of someone being forced to acknowledge a particularly irritating insect. His eyes swept over Elena with undisguised contempt, taking in her server's uniform, her tired posture after a long day of classes and work, and the small scar on her hand from a childhood accident that spoke of a life lived without the cushion of inherited privilege. "You're not Maria," he stated, with the obvious displeasure of someone whose routine had been disrupted by the inconvenience of human suffering. "No, sir, I'm not. Maria had a family emergency tonight, but I'm fully qualified to provide you with excellent service. Family emergency, Ronald repeated with mocking skepticism. How convenient. Tell me, Elena, do you have any family emergencies planned for tonight that might interfere with your ability to do your job properly? The question was delivered with such casual cruelty that several nearby diners turned to stare. Elena felt heat rising in her cheeks, but maintained her composure with the discipline of someone who had encountered entitled individuals before, though none quite so ruthlessly dehumanizing as the man sitting before her. No, sir. I'm completely focused on ensuring your dining experience is perfect. Perfect. Ronald savored the word like fine wine. That's an ambitious promise from someone I've never seen before. Tell me about your qualifications. How long have you been serving people who matter? The question was designed to humiliate, to establish hierarchy, to remind Elena that in Ronald's world, her value was measured solely by her usefulness to his comfort. Elena recognized the game he was playing. She had studied workplace harassment in her legal courses and had written papers on power dynamics in service industries. I've been with Le Grand Palais for 2 years, sir. Before that, I worked at several other establishments while completing my education. Education? Ronald's eyebrows raised with theatrical surprise. How fascinating. A server with academic pretensions. Tell me, what exactly are you studying? I'm curious to understand what passes for higher learning among the service class these days. The conversation was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for everyone within earshot. Frank Morrison hovered nearby, torn between his duty to protect his staff and his terror of Ronald's retaliation. Other servers had slowed their movements to listen, sensing that something significant was unfolding at table 12. I'm pursuing a law degree, sir, Elena replied, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the obvious contempt in Ronald's voice. Ronald's laughter exploded across the restaurant like a gunshot. A law degree? How absolutely precious. A waitress who thinks she's going to become a lawyer. He looked around the restaurant as if seeking an audience for his entertainment. Tell me, Elena the lawyer, what type of law do you plan to practice? Defending other servers who can't manage to bring food to tables without incident. Elena felt something shift inside her chest. Throughout her life, she had endured condescension from professors who assumed her intelligence based on her background, from classmates who questioned her presence in advanced courses, from employers who saw her uniform before her humanity. But there was something particularly venomous about Ronald's attack that struck deeper than mere snobbery. I'm interested in corporate law, actually, Elena responded with quiet dignity. Specifically, workplace harassment and employee rights protection. The words hung in the air like a challenge, though Elena hadn't intended them as such. Ronald's expression shifted subtly, his predatory smile faltering for just a moment as he processed the implications of her specialty. How appropriate, he recovered quickly, his voice dropping to a more dangerous register. Perhaps tonight will provide you with some real-world education in power dynamics. Because in the real world, Elena, people like you serve people like me. That's not harassment, that's natural order. Frank Morrison finally stepped forward, sensing that the situation was spiraling beyond acceptable limits even by Ronald's standards. Mr. Blackwell, perhaps we could discuss tonight's wine selection. Chef Philippe has prepared something special that I know you'll appreciate. Ronald held up one manicured hand without taking his eyes off Elena. Frank, I'm having an educational conversation with your aspiring lawyer here. Don't interrupt when adults are speaking. The dismissal was so casually cruel that Frank felt his face burn with humiliation, but he retreated as commanded, leaving Elena to face Ronald's attention alone. Now then, Elena, Ronald continued, savoring each word like a predator playing with wounded prey. Since you're so interested in corporate law, perhaps you'd like to understand exactly how the real world works. Do you know who I am? You're Mr. Blackwell, sir. I'm Ronald Blackwell, founder and CEO of Blackwell Industries. I employ 14,000 people across 6 countries. I own controlling interests in companies that probably manufactured the clothes you're wearing, the phone in your pocket, and the car you drive to your little law school classes. Elena remained silent, sensing that Ronald was building towards something devastating. I also happen to own a significant stake in Metropolitan University, Ronald continued with growing satisfaction. The same institution where you're pursuing your precious law degree. I sit on the board of trustees, and my donations have funded the construction of buildings, the creation of scholarships, and the salaries of professors who determine whether students like you succeed or fail. The revelation hit Elena like ice water. She had known that wealthy benefactors influenced university decisions, but hearing it stated so boldly, with such casual menace, made her stomach clench with fear. So tell me, Elena, the lawyer. Ronald leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of someone holding all the cards. How important do you think it is that tonight's service meets my exacting standards? How crucial is it that I leave this restaurant completely satisfied with every aspect of my experience? Elena realized she was trapped in a situation that went far beyond a difficult customer. This wasn't just about tonight's tips, or even her job at the restaurant. Ronald Blackwell had just made it clear that her entire future, her degree, her career aspirations, her ability to help her brother with medical expenses, hung in the balance of the next few hours. But something in Elena's spirit refused to bend, even as she understood the stakes. Years of fighting for every opportunity, every grade, every small victory had forged something unbreakable in her character. She looked directly into Ronald Blackwell's eyes and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Service is very important, Mr. Blackwell, she said with quiet strength. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. Everyone. The emphasis on the final word was subtle, but unmistakable. Elena Rodriguez had just drawn a line in the sand. The tension in Le Grand Palais had shifted from uncomfortable to electric. Other diners pretended to focus on their meals, while straining to catch every word of the confrontation unfolding at table 12. Elena's subtle defiance had not gone unnoticed by Ronald, whose predatory instincts recognized a challenge when one was presented. Everyone deserves respect and dignity. Ronald repeated Elena's words slowly, as if tasting something bitter. How refreshingly naive. Tell me, Elena, has your law school education covered the concept of economic reality? Or are you still living in the fantasy world where idealism pays tuition bills? Elena felt her heart racing, but kept her voice steady. My education has taught me that rights exist regardless of economic status, Mr. Blackwell. The law doesn't recognize different classes of human worth. Ronald's smile turned razor sharp. The law is a luxury, my dear. Written by people like me, interpreted by judges I help elect, and enforced by systems I help fund. Your textbooks might say everyone is equal, but reality operates on different principles. Frank Morrison watched from across the restaurant, his hands trembling as he polished the same wine glass for the third time. He had witnessed Ronald destroy careers over much smaller slights than what was currently unfolding. The smart thing would be to intervene, to sacrifice Elena to protect the rest of his staff. But something about her quiet dignity made him hesitate. Let me share some reality with you, Ronald continued, leaning forward with the intensity of a predator cornering prey. Last month, a manager at one of my subsidiary companies thought he could challenge my decisions. He had a mortgage, 2 children, and 15 years of stellar performance reviews. Today, he's delivering pizzas because no company in this city will hire him. Not because he was incompetent, but because crossing me comes with consequences that extend far beyond the workplace. Elena's stomach clenched, but she refused to show fear. Are you threatening me, Mr. Blackwell? Threatening? Ronald laughed, the sound devoid of warmth. I'm educating you. There's a difference between threats and explanations of cause and effect. When you drop a glass, it breaks. When you challenge someone with real power, your opportunities disappear. It's simple physics. From across the dining room, Isabella Chen, a corporate attorney dining alone, looked up from her salmon. She had been only half listening to the conversation, but Ronald's words made her pay closer attention. As someone who specialized in employment law, she recognized the dangerous territory this conversation was entering. Mr. Blackwell, Elena said carefully, I believe there may be a misunderstanding. I'm simply here to provide you with excellent service. If there's something specific you'd like to order, I'd be happy to help. Oh, but I am ordering something specific, Ronald replied with deadly sweetness. I'm ordering you to understand your place in the natural hierarchy. You see, Elena, people like you exist to serve people like me. That's not cruelty. That's civilization functioning as designed. Elena felt anger flaring in her chest. Years of working multiple jobs, studying until dawn, and fighting for every opportunity had prepared her for many challenges. but not this calculated psychological assault from someone who seemed to view her fundamental humanity as negotiable. I understand service, Mr. Blackwell. What I don't understand is why providing excellent service requires accepting disrespect. The words hung in the air, like a gauntlet thrown down. Several nearby tables had gone completely silent, their occupants no longer pretending to ignore the confrontation. Frank Morrison closed his eyes, knowing that Eleanor had just crossed a line from which there might be no return. Ronald's expression shifted, his casual cruelty hardening into something more dangerous. Disrespect? You think honesty about your circumstances constitutes disrespect? Let me clarify something, Eleanor. I don't disrespect you. I simply don't respect you. There's a difference. Respect is earned through achievement, through contribution to society, through demonstrating value beyond the ability to carry plates. And what have you contributed to society, Mr. Blackwell? Elena asked quietly. The question hit the restaurant like a thunderclap. Frank Morrison's wine glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor. Isabella Chen looked up sharply, suddenly fully invested in the conversation. Even the kitchen staff, who had been listening through the service window, went silent. Ronald stared at Elena with genuine shock. In 52 years of life, 30 years of business dominance, and a decade of treating Le Grand Palais as his personal kingdom, no one had ever dared to question his fundamental worth. What have I contributed? Ronald's voice dropped to a whisper more menacing than any shout. I've built an empire that employs thousands of people. I've generated billions in economic value. I've funded hospitals, universities, and research facilities. My taxes alone probably fund the salaries of a dozen public servants. And I'm sure those contributions are valuable, Elena replied with infuriating calm. But creating jobs while treating employees as disposable, funding universities while threatening students, and paying taxes while buying political influence, do those really count as contributions to society, or just to your own power? Isabella Chen set down her fork entirely, her attention now completely focused on the young server who was systematically dismantling one of the most powerful men in the city, with nothing but logical questions and moral clarity. Ronald felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the sensation of losing control of a situation. Elena wasn't responding to his intimidation tactics with the fear and submission he expected. Instead, she was forcing him to justify himself, to defend positions he had never questioned. You're lecturing me about power and influence? Ronald's voice rose slightly, his composure cracking. You're a waitress with law school debt questioning someone who could buy your entire university with pocket change. Money doesn't make someone's opinions more valid, Mr. Blackwell. It just makes them louder. Tommy Garcia, a 19-year-old busboy who had been clearing nearby tables, stopped his work entirely. He had been on the receiving end of Ronald's cruelty before, a humiliating incident weeks earlier that had left him questioning his own worth. Watching Elena stand her ground was giving him something he hadn't felt in months, hope that dignity wasn't negotiable. You want to discuss validity? Ronald stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. Let me show you validity. Frank Morrison appeared instantly, his face pale with terror. Yes, Mr. Blackwell? I want this server removed from my site immediately, and I want her employment terminated tonight. Anyone who can't understand basic respect has no place in an establishment I patronize. The demand hung in the air like a death sentence. Elena felt the weight of every eye in the restaurant focused on her, understanding that her livelihood, her education, and her brother's medical care all depended on what happened in the next few moments. But instead of the fear Ronald expected to see in her eyes, he found something that made his blood run cold. Pity. I feel sorry for you, Mr. Blackwell, Elena said softly. You have everything money can buy, but you've never learned the difference between power and strength, between wealth and worth, between commanding fear and earning respect. Ronald Blackwell, who had built an empire on the ability to intimidate and control, found himself face to face with someone who refused to be intimidated or controlled. And for the first time in his adult life, he didn't know what to do next. The silence that followed Elena's devastating words stretched across Le Grand Palais like a held breath. Ronald Blackwell stood frozen beside his table, his face cycling through expressions of shock, rage, and something he hadn't experienced in decades, genuine uncertainty. The woman who had just pitied him to his face was supposed to be cowering, begging for mercy, accepting her place in the natural order he had spent his life constructing. Instead, Elena Rodriguez stood with her chin raised, her eyes clear, radiating a quiet strength that seemed to fill the entire restaurant. She wasn't backing down, wasn't apologizing, wasn't even attempting to save herself from the professional destruction he had promised. She was simply standing there, waiting for his next move with the patience of someone who had already decided that some principles were worth any price. "You feel sorry for me," Ronald repeated slowly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made nearby diners shift uncomfortably in their seats. A server with student debt feels sorry for a man worth $12 billion. "Yes, Mr. Blackwell, I do," Elena replied without hesitation. "Because all that money hasn't bought you the one thing that actually matters. The ability to see other people as human beings worthy of basic respect." Frank Morrison realized his hands were shaking as he watched his carefully ordered world disintegrate in real time. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene, to apologize to Ronald, to sacrifice Elena to preserve the delicate peace that kept his restaurant profitable. But something about Elena's courage had awakened a part of his conscience that he had buried under years of compromise and accommodation. Isabella Chen quietly reached into her purse and activated her phone's recording function. As a corporate attorney specializing in employment law, she recognized that she was witnessing something that could have significant legal implications. Ronald's earlier threats about his influence over Elena's university, combined with his obvious abuse of power in the workplace, created potential liability issues that extended far beyond this restaurant. "You think respect is something I owe you?" Ronald's voice rose again, his carefully maintained facade beginning to crack. "Respect is earned through accomplishment, through creating value, through demonstrating worth. What have you accomplished? What value have you created? What worth have you demonstrated beyond the ability to carry food from kitchen to table?" Elena didn't flinch. "I've worked 3 jobs while maintaining a perfect GPA in law school. I've supported my family through medical crises while never missing a day of work. I've treated every customer with dignity, regardless of how they treated me. I've studied employment law specifically to protect people from exactly the kind of abuse you're demonstrating right now." Tommy Garcia stopped pretending to bus tables and turned to face the confrontation directly. Weeks earlier, Ronald had humiliated him for accidentally bumping into his chair, calling him worthless and threatening to have him fired. Tommy had gone home that night questioning his own value, wondering if powerful people like Ronald were right about people like him. Watching Elena defend herself was showing him a different possibility, that dignity wasn't something that could be taken away by someone else's cruelty. "Employment law," Ronald laughed, but the sound carried an edge of hysteria now. "You're going to protect people with employment law? Do you have any idea how many lawyers I employ? Do you understand how many judges I've helped elect? Do you comprehend the difference between idealistic theories and practical reality? I understand that threatening someone's education and career because they won't accept verbal abuse is illegal, regardless of how much money or influence you have," Elena replied calmly. The words hit the restaurant like a lightning strike. Isabella Chen looked up sharply, her legal mind immediately recognizing the significance of what Elena had just articulated. Ronald had indeed made explicit threats about Elena's university funding and career prospects, creating a clear pattern of retaliation for protected activity. "Illegal!" Ronald sputtered, his composure completely shattered now. "You're accusing me of illegal behavior? I'm explaining economic reality to someone too naive to understand how the world actually works." "Mr. Blackwell," Elena said with devastating calm, "threatening someone's livelihood because they refuse to accept harassment is retaliation. Using your position on university boards to intimidate students is abuse of power. Creating hostile work environments through systematic humiliation is workplace harassment. These aren't economic realities, they're violations of federal law." Frank Morrison felt his knees go weak. Elena wasn't just standing up to Ronald Blackwell. She was systematically dismantling his entire approach to human interaction using legal principles that Frank dimly remembered from his business training. More terrifying still, everything she was saying sounded absolutely correct. "You think you can threaten me with legal consequences?" Ronald's voice had risen to a level that made conversations throughout the restaurant impossible to ignore. "Do you have any conception of what I could do to you, to this restaurant, to everyone who works here?" Are you threatening collective retaliation against employees who witness harassment? Elena asked, her voice still maddeningly calm. Because that would be another federal violation. Isabella Chen stood up from her table, no longer able to remain a passive observer. As a senior partner at Williams & Associates, one of the city's most prestigious law firms, she had an ethical obligation to intervene when she witnessed clear violations of employment law. More personally, she was inspired by Elena's courage and disgusted by Ronald's behavior. "Excuse me," Isabella announced, her voice cutting across the restaurant with professional authority. "I'm Isabella Chen, corporate attorney with Williams & Associates. I've been observing this conversation, and I believe there may be some legal issues that need clarification." Ronald turned toward Isabella with wild eyes, suddenly realizing that his private humiliation session had acquired a professional witness. "This is a private conversation between myself and staff member. Your involvement is neither requested nor appropriate." "Actually, sir, threats of retaliation for protected activity become matters of public concern when they occur in public spaces," Isabella replied coolly. "And as an officer of the court, I have certain obligations when I witness potential violations of federal employment law." Elena felt a surge of gratitude toward this stranger, who had chosen to involve herself in a situation that could have serious professional consequences. But more than gratitude, she felt validation. Her legal training hadn't been wrong. Ronald's behavior was indeed crossing lines that society had decided were unacceptable. Federal violations. Ronald looked back and forth between Elena and Isabella, his earlier confidence evaporating as he realized the situation was spiraling beyond his control. "This is absurd. I'm a customer in a restaurant having a conversation with a server about service standards." "Mr. Blackwell," Isabella said firmly, "you explicitly threatened this woman's educational funding and career prospects because she refused to accept verbal abuse. You threatened collective retaliation against other employees. You created a hostile work environment through systematic humiliation. These actions constitute clear violations of Title VII, the Civil Rights Act, and several other federal statutes." Tommy Garcia found his voice for the first time in months. "He did the same thing to me," he said quietly, then louder as courage built in his chest. "A few weeks ago, he called me worthless and threatened to get me fired because I accidentally bumped his chair." Frank Morrison felt the room spinning. If multiple employees had been subjected to Ronald's harassment, if there were witnesses, if a corporate attorney was documenting everything, his restaurant could be facing legal consequences that would destroy everything he had worked to build. But then Frank looked at Elena's face, saw the quiet dignity with which she had endured Ronald's assault, remembered the countless times he had watched good employees suffer in silence to protect Ronald's delicate ego. Maybe destruction of the status quo wasn't the worst thing that could happen. "Mr. Blackwell," Frank heard himself saying, his voice stronger than he had expected, "I think you should leave." The words seemed to echo from a different universe. Ronald stared at Frank with absolute incomprehension, as if his longtime servant had suddenly begun speaking an alien language. "What did you say to me?" "I said you should leave," Frank repeated, feeling years of suppressed dignity flooding back into his voice. "Elena is right. You've been abusing my staff for years, and I've been too afraid to stop you. But watching her courage tonight has reminded me that some things matter more than money." Ronald looked around the restaurant wildly, seeking support from the other diners, who had always deferred to his presence. Instead, he found dozens of eyes staring at him with mixtures of disgust, disappointment, and something that made his stomach clench with unfamiliar emotion: pity. "You people have no idea what you've done tonight," Ronald said, his voice shaking with rage and something that might have been fear. "No idea what this is going to cost you." Elena stepped forward one final time, her voice carrying across the silent restaurant with crystal clarity. "Mr. Blackwell, the only thing tonight is going to cost us is our illusions about what kind of person money can make someone. And honestly, that's a price worth paying." Ronald Blackwell, who had never lost a confrontation in his adult life, found himself standing in a restaurant full of people who no longer feared him, no longer respected him, and no longer believed that his money gave him the right to treat them as less than human. For the first time in decades, Ronald Blackwell had absolutely no idea what to do next. The silence that followed Ronald's threat stretched across Le Grand Palais like the calm before a hurricane. Every person in the restaurant understood they had just witnessed something unprecedented. The public humiliation of a man who had built his identity on the foundation of others' fear. But Ronald Blackwell hadn't survived 3 decades in corporate warfare by accepting defeat gracefully. His eyes swept across the restaurant one final time, cataloging faces, memorizing details, already calculating the revenge he would extract from every person who had dared to witness his humiliation. When his gaze landed on Eleanor, still standing with that infuriating dignity intact, something dark and calculating settled over his features. "You think this is over?" Ronald said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than his earlier shouting. "You think you've won something here tonight, but let me explain what happens next." Isabella Chen stepped closer, her phone still recording, her legal training screaming warnings about what Ronald might say next. "Mr. Blackwell, I would strongly advise you to consider your words carefully. You're already facing potential legal liability for tonight's actions." Ronald ignored her completely, his focus laser-sharp on Elena. "Tomorrow morning, I make a phone call to the dean at Metropolitan University. I explain that a scholarship recipient has been engaging in inappropriate workplace behavior, creating disturbances, and demonstrating the kind of character issues that reflect poorly on the institution." Elena felt ice forming in her stomach, but kept her expression steady. "You're describing defamation, Mr. Blackwell. Knowingly making false statements to damage someone's reputation is another federal crime." "Ooh, false statements." Ronald's smile was razor thin. "I'm describing exactly what I witnessed tonight. A server who created a public disturbance, who argued with a customer, who demonstrated unprofessional behavior that disrupted the entire restaurant. Multiple witnesses can confirm these facts." Frank Morrison felt his chest tighten as he realized the trap Ronald was constructing. Every word was technically true, even as it completely inverted the moral reality of what had occurred. Ronald was demonstrating exactly the kind of legal manipulation that had built his empire, using technicalities to destroy people who couldn't afford to fight back. "Then I make another phone call," Ronald continued, his voice gaining strength as he warmed to his theme. "To the licensing board that regulates this restaurant. I explain that Le Grand Palais has created an environment where staff feel comfortable harassing customers, where management fails to maintain appropriate service standards, where the atmosphere has become hostile to legitimate patrons." Tommy Garcia stepped forward, his youthful face flushed with anger. "That's not what happened. You were the one harassing everyone. You were the one being hostile." Ronald turned his predatory gaze toward Tommy, and the young man instinctively stepped back. "And you, Tommy, will discover that your immigration status requires review. I'm sure the authorities will be very interested in examining whether your documentation is entirely accurate." The threat hit Tommy like a physical blow. His family had immigrated legally, but the process had been complex, involving paperwork that a 19-year-old didn't fully understand. The thought of government investigators examining his status, questioning his right to be in the country, was terrifying enough to make his knees weak. "That's enough," Isabella Chen said sharply, her attorney's training finally overriding her shock at Ronald's brazen corruption. "Mr. Blackwell, you've just threatened to abuse government agencies to retaliate against witnesses to your harassment. You've threatened to file false reports with regulatory bodies. These actions constitute criminal conspiracy and abuse of process." Ronald finally turned his attention to Isabella, his expression shifting as he recognized her as the most dangerous person in the room. Unlike Elena, Frank, and Tommy, Isabella had resources, connections, and the legal expertise to actually challenge him. "Ms. Chen, isn't it? I believe I know your firm. Williams & Associates has done some work for my companies over the years. I'm sure your partners would be very interested to know that one of their attorneys is involving herself in situations that could create conflicts of interest with important clients." Isabella felt a chill of recognition. Ronald wasn't just threatening her personally. He was threatening her entire professional life, her colleagues, the law firm that had given her opportunities to build her career. The implications were staggering and immediately effective. But then Isabella looked at Elena's face, saw the quiet courage that had inspired an entire restaurant to find their voices, and made a decision that would define her character for the rest of her life. "Mr. Blackwell, my firm's policy is very clear about situations involving witness intimidation and retaliation. We're ethically obligated to support employees who report harassment, regardless of potential business implications. If Williams & Associates has any clients who expect us to ignore federal crimes, then perhaps those aren't the kind of clients we should represent. Elena stared at Isabella with profound gratitude. This woman, who had nothing to gain and everything to lose, was choosing principle over profit, justice over job security. It was exactly the kind of courage that Elena had hoped to find in the legal profession. Ronald felt the situation slipping further from his control. His standard intimidation tactics weren't working because these people were choosing to support each other rather than protecting themselves individually. It was a dynamic he had rarely encountered and didn't know how to counter. "Fine," Ronald said, his voice taking on a different quality, cold, calculating, final. "If that's how you want to play this game, then let's play." "Elena, you think your education matters. Tomorrow, Metropolitan University loses its largest benefactor. Professors whose research I fund will discover their grants have been terminated. Students whose scholarships I provide will receive notices that their funding is discontinued." The scope of the threat was breathtaking. Ronald wasn't just targeting Elena anymore. He was threatening to punish hundreds of innocent people as collective retaliation for her defiance. "Buildings I've funded will need to find new sources of maintenance funding," Ronald continued remorselessly. "Programs I've supported will discover that their budgets have been eliminated. The medical research center that bears my name will receive notice that all future donations are suspended indefinitely." Elena realized she was witnessing something monstrous, a man so consumed by ego that he was willing to destroy educational opportunities for countless students, end medical research that could save lives, and devastate an entire institution simply because one person had refused to accept his abuse. But Frank Morrison surprised everyone, including himself, by starting to laugh. "You know what, Ronald?" Frank said, using the billionaire's first name for the first time in 10 years. "Go ahead. Make your phone calls. File your complaints. Threaten whoever you want. Because I just realized something important." Ronald turned toward Frank with dangerous interest. "And what's that?" "I've been afraid of you for so long that I forgot the most important fact about bullies," Frank replied, his voice growing stronger with every word. "They only have power over people who give them that power. And I'm done being afraid of you." "You're done being afraid?" Ronald laughed, but the sound carried an edge of hysteria. "Frank, I can destroy this restaurant with a single phone call. I can have health inspectors here tomorrow, fire marshals the next day, tax auditors by the end of the week. I can turn your life into a living nightmare." "Maybe," Frank acknowledged. "But you know what you can't do? You can't make me respect you. You can't make me admire you. You can't make me believe that having money makes you a better person. And most importantly, you can't make me go back to being the kind of person who stands by and watches good people get hurt." Elena felt tears forming in her eyes as she watched Frank Morrison transform from a frightened manager into someone willing to sacrifice everything for principle. Tommy straightened his shoulders, inspired by Frank's courage. Isabella smiled with genuine pride at the character being displayed by people she had only just met. Ronald looked around the restaurant one final time, seeking any sign of the fear and submission that had always been his most reliable weapons. Instead, he found something he had never encountered before, a room full of people who had decided that their dignity was worth more than their safety. "You people have no idea what you've started tonight," Ronald said, his voice shaking with rage and something that might have been desperation. "No idea what this is going to cost all of you." Elena stepped forward one last time, her voice carrying across the silent restaurant with absolute clarity. "Mr. Blackwell, we know exactly what this might cost us. The question is, do you know what it's already cost you?" Ronald stared at her with complete incomprehension. "What are you talking about?" "Your humanity," Elena said simply. "Your ability to connect with other people. Your chance to use your wealth and influence to make the world better instead of worse. Your opportunity to be remembered as someone who lifted others up instead of someone who crushed them down." "Those are luxuries I can't afford," Ronald replied automatically. "No, Mr. Blackwell," Elena said with infinite sadness. "Those are luxuries you chose not to afford, and that choice has made you the poorest person in this room." Ronald Blackwell walked out of Le Grand Palais that night carrying $12 billion in assets and a reputation that had taken 30 years to build. but for the first time in his adult life, he felt completely bankrupt. Days after the confrontation at Le Grand Palais, Ronald Blackwell sat in his penthouse office, staring at documents that should have excited him. Quarterly reports showing record profits, acquisition proposals worth hundreds of millions, invitations to exclusive events where he would be celebrated as a titan of industry. Instead, Elena's final words echoed in his mind like a relentless drumbeat. "You are the poorest person in this room." His assistant, Caroline Walsh, entered with her usual efficiency, carrying a stack of messages and updates. "Mr. Blackwell, the board meeting has been moved to 3 o'clock. The mayor's office called about the charity gala, and Metropolitan University wants to schedule a meeting about the research facility funding." Ronald looked up sharply. "What about the university meeting?" "They want to discuss expansion of the scholarship program you fund. Apparently, there's been increased interest from qualified applicants." The irony wasn't lost on Ronald. While he had threatened to destroy Elena's educational opportunities, the very programs he funded continued to help students like her, young people from working families who possessed the intelligence and determination to succeed if given the chance. "Cancel the meeting," Ronald said automatically, then stopped himself. "Actually, no. Schedule it for next week. I want to understand exactly how these programs work." Caroline looked surprised but made notes. As she turned to leave, Ronald found himself asking an unexpected question. "Caroline, in your opinion, what kind of employer am I?" She froze, clearly unprepared for such personal inquiry. "Sir, you're very successful. Your companies are profitable and well managed. That's not what I asked. I asked what kind of employer I am to the people who work for me." Caroline's discomfort was visible. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm not sure I understand the question. Do I treat my employees well? Do they respect me or do they fear me? When they go home at night, do they feel valued or do they feel diminished?" The questions hung in the air like grenades with pulled pins. Caroline had worked for Ronald for 7 years, had witnessed countless interactions with subordinates, had seen careers destroyed by his casual cruelty, but she had also seen his brilliant strategic mind, his ability to create opportunities, his potential for something greater. "Sir, I think you have the capacity to be an exceptional leader. But leadership requires seeing employees as complete human beings, not just as functions in a business operation." Ronald stared at her, realizing that in 7 years of daily interaction, this was the first honest conversation they had ever had. "And you don't think I see employees as human beings?" "Mr. Blackwell, when was the last time you asked about someone's family? When did you last remember a subordinate's name without checking your notes? When have you considered how your words affect people's sense of self-worth?" The questions hit Ronald like physical blows. He realized that Caroline was right. He had spent decades treating employees as interchangeable resources rather than individuals with hopes, fears, families, and dreams. Meanwhile, across the city, Eleanor was discovering that standing up to Ronald Blackwell had consequences she hadn't anticipated. Word of the restaurant confrontation had spread through social media, local news, and professional networks. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from reporters, job offers from law firms, and support from strangers who had heard her story. Isabella Chen had called personally to offer Elena a summer internship at Williams & Associates, with the specific mandate to work on employment law cases. "What you demonstrated that night wasn't just courage," Isabella had explained. "It was exactly the kind of legal reasoning and moral clarity our profession needs." But the most surprising call came from Tommy Garcia. "Elena, I wanted to thank you. After watching you stand up to him, I realized I didn't have to accept being treated like I was worthless. I applied to community college. I got accepted." Frank Morrison had also called with unexpected news. Le Grand Palais has had more reservation requests this week than in the previous month. Apparently, people want to dine at the restaurant where someone finally stood up to Ronald Blackwell. "We're completely booked for weeks." Elena realized that her decision to defend her dignity had created ripple effects she never could have predicted. People who had felt powerless in their own lives were finding inspiration in her example, discovering that courage could be contagious. Back in his penthouse, Ronald made a decision that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. He picked up his phone and dialed Le Grand Palais. "This is Ronald Blackwell. I'd like to speak with Elena Rodriguez." Frank Morrison's voice was cautious but not hostile. "Mr. Blackwell, Elena doesn't work here anymore. After what happened, she decided to focus on her studies full-time. But I can take a message. Tell her I'd like to meet with her, privately, to discuss how someone like me might begin to understand what it means to be a better person. The request was so unexpected that Frank was silent for several moments. Mr. Blackwell, are you serious? I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Ronald hung up and returned to staring out his office windows at the city below. For the first time in decades, he was seeing it not as a kingdom to be dominated, but as a community of human beings deserving of respect and dignity. Elena's words had planted something in his mind that was growing stronger every day. The uncomfortable recognition that true poverty wasn't about lacking money, but about lacking the ability to connect meaningfully with other human beings. Ronald Blackwell was worth $12 billion, but he was finally beginning to understand that he had been living as the poorest man in the world. Elena Rodriguez sat in the campus coffee shop at Metropolitan University, her laptop open to employment law case studies, when her phone buzzed with Frank Morrison's message about Ronald Blackwell's request for a meeting. She stared at the screen for several minutes, her coffee growing cold as she processed the implications. "He wants to meet with me?" she asked aloud, drawing curious glances from nearby students. Her study partner, Jessica Martinez, a fellow law student who had become fascinated by Elena's viral confrontation with the billionaire, leaned over to read the message. "Elena, you can't seriously be considering this. The guy threatened to destroy your education, your career, everyone who supported you. This could be some kind of trap." Elena understood Jessica's concern, but something in Frank's description of Ronald's tone suggested genuine desperation rather than calculated revenge. Still, agreeing to meet with someone who had demonstrated such vindictive power felt incredibly dangerous. Meanwhile, across the city, Ronald was discovering that his moment of vulnerability with Caroline had unleashed consequences he hadn't anticipated. Word of his unusual questions about employee treatment had spread through his executive team, creating confusion and concern among managers who had built their careers on his previous leadership style. "Sir," his chief operating officer, Robert Sterling, entered his office with obvious agitation. "I've been hearing some concerning reports about changes in company direction. Several department heads are asking whether we're implementing new human resources policies that might affect performance management." Ronald looked up from financial reports he had been unable to concentrate on. "What kind of concerns, Robert?" "Well, sir, your reputation for maintaining high standards has always been one of our competitive advantages. If employees start expecting softer treatment, it could impact productivity and discipline." The conversation revealed something Ronald hadn't considered. His entire corporate culture was built on fear-based management that his executives had internalized and replicated throughout the organization. Changing his own behavior wouldn't automatically transform a system that had operated on intimidation for decades. "Robert, when you say high standards, what exactly do you mean?" "You know, sir, clear consequences for underperformance, immediate termination for employees who don't meet expectations. The understanding that employment here is a privilege that can be revoked at any time." Ronald felt a disturbing recognition in Robert's words. They perfectly echoed his own attitudes, but hearing them articulated by someone else made them sound cruel and dehumanizing in ways he hadn't previously acknowledged. "And you believe fear of termination makes employees more productive?" Robert looked confused by the question. "Of course, sir. People work harder when they understand the stakes. Comfort breeds complacency. What about innovation, creativity, the kind of thinking that comes from employees who feel secure enough to take intellectual risks?" "Sir, with respect, we've been incredibly successful using our current approach. Our profit margins are industry-leading, our efficiency ratings are exceptional. Why would we change a system that clearly works?" Ronald realized he was confronting the first real resistance to his emerging transformation. Robert wasn't wrong about their financial success. Blackwell Industries had indeed thrived using fear-based management. The question was whether financial success justified human cost, and whether there might be even greater success possible through different approaches. "Schedule a meeting with human resources," Ronald decided. "I want comprehensive data on employee turnover, satisfaction surveys, exit interview feedback, and productivity metrics compared to industry standards." Robert's discomfort was obvious. "Sir, is there a specific problem you're trying to address? If there are performance issues in particular departments, We can handle those through established channels. I'm trying to understand whether our established channels are actually serving the company's long-term interests. After Robert left, clearly bewildered by the conversation, Ronald made a decision that surprised even himself. He called Elena Rodriguez directly. "Ms. Rodriguez, this is Ronald Blackwell. I understand Frank Morrison shared my request to meet with you." Elena's voice was cautious but not hostile. "Yes, Mr. Blackwell. I received the message, though I have to admit, I'm not sure what purpose such a meeting would serve. I want to understand something that you said at the restaurant. You told me I was the poorest person in the room. I've been thinking about that statement, and I realize I don't fully comprehend what you meant. Mr. Blackwell, with respect, I think you understood exactly what I meant. The question is whether you're genuinely interested in change, or whether this is another form of manipulation." The directness of her challenge forced Ronald to confront his own motivations. Was his desire to meet with Elena genuine, or was he simply seeking a way to restore his damaged ego by demonstrating that he could win her approval? "I don't know," Ronald admitted, the honesty surprising them both. "I've spent so many years believing that power and wealth were the measures of success that I'm not sure I'm capable of understanding different values. But I'd like to try." Elena considered his words carefully. Throughout her legal studies, she had learned that true systemic change required engaging with people in power, even when those people had previously been adversaries. If Ronald Blackwell was genuinely questioning his approach to human relationships, the potential impact could extend far beyond their personal interaction. "Mr. Blackwell, if we meet, it won't be so you can feel better about yourself. It won't be so you can claim you've been reformed without actually changing your behavior. It will be because you're willing to confront uncomfortable truths about how your actions have affected real people's lives. What would that look like? It would mean talking to employees you've humiliated, not just me. It would mean understanding the actual impact of your threats and intimidation on families, careers, and communities. It would mean accepting that good intentions don't erase harmful actions, and that real change requires sustained effort, not just momentary guilt." Ronald felt his defensive instincts flaring. "Ms. Rodriguez, I employ thousands of people. I've created opportunities, generated economic value, contributed to charitable causes. Surely that counts for something. Mr. Blackwell, the fact that you can't separate your business achievements from your personal character tells me you're not ready for the kind of conversation I thought you were requesting." The criticism stung because it was accurate. Ronald had spent so long conflating his professional success with moral worth that he couldn't imagine being evaluated on different criteria. "Then, help me understand how to separate them." Elena was quiet for several moments, weighing the sincerity in his voice against the reality of his past behavior. Finally, she made a decision that would test both of their commitments to change. "Mr. Blackwell, I'll meet with you on one condition. We don't meet alone, and we don't meet in a space you control. Tommy Garcia, Frank Morrison, and Isabella Chen will be present. If you want to understand how your behavior affects people, you need to hear from multiple perspectives, not just mine." Ronald felt his stomach clench at the thought of facing all the people who had witnessed his humiliation, but recognized that Elena's demand was reasonable. If he was serious about understanding different viewpoints, he couldn't control the conversation by limiting the participants. "I agree to your terms. And Mr. Blackwell, this isn't about you finding redemption or feeling better about your past. This is about you deciding whether you're willing to do the hard work of becoming someone who earns respect through character rather than commanding fear through power." After hanging up, Ronald sat in his penthouse office realizing that agreeing to Elena's terms meant subjecting himself to exactly the kind of accountability he had spent his entire career avoiding. He would have to listen to criticism he couldn't dismiss, face consequences he couldn't control, and accept judgment from people he had previously considered beneath his notice. For the first time since the restaurant confrontation, Ronald Blackwell understood that real change would be much more difficult and uncomfortable than he had imagined. 6 months later, Elena Rodriguez stood before the Metropolitan University Board of Trustees, no longer a server struggling to pay tuition, but as the youngest recipient of the university's Distinguished Alumni Award. The auditorium was packed with students, faculty, and community leaders who had come to hear her speak about courage, dignity, and the power of standing up for what's right. When I confronted Ronald Blackwell that night at Le Grand Palais, Elena began, her voice carrying across the silent auditorium, I had no idea that one moment of refusing to accept disrespect would change so many lives. But I've learned that courage is contagious, and when one person decides their dignity is non-negotiable, it gives others permission to find their own strength. In the audience, Tommy Garcia sat in his community college graduation cap, having just completed his associate degree with plans to transfer to Metropolitan University in the fall. Beside him, Frank Morrison wore his best suit, having recently opened his own restaurant where respect and dignity were foundational values rather than afterthoughts. Isabella Chen, now leading a pro bono employment law clinic funded by an anonymous donor, smiled with pride as Elena continued her speech. The clinic had helped hundreds of workers understand their rights and find the courage to report harassment and discrimination. But the most significant presence in the auditorium was Ronald Blackwell himself, sitting in the back row where he had requested to be placed. The past 6 months had been the most difficult and transformative period of his life. The meeting Elena had demanded with Tommy, Frank, and Isabella had been brutal in its honesty, forcing him to confront the human cost of decades of cruel behavior. Ronald had listened as Tommy described the sleepless nights after being humiliated, the way it had affected his confidence in every area of life. Frank had explained how watching good employees suffer in silence had slowly eroded his own sense of integrity. Isabella had detailed the legal violations that could have destroyed careers and lives if pursued. But more challenging than facing his victims had been the work that followed. Ronald had voluntarily submitted to a comprehensive review of Blackwell Industries' workplace culture, bringing in independent consultants to interview employees anonymously about their experiences. The results had been devastating and undeniable. The company-wide changes that followed were unprecedented. Ronald had implemented restorative justice programs for employees who had been mistreated, comprehensive sensitivity training for all managers, and employee advocacy systems that protected workers who reported problems. Productivity hadn't suffered. It had actually increased as fear was replaced by mutual respect. The most important lesson I've learned, Elena continued, is that real change doesn't happen when powerful people decide to be nicer. It happens when ordinary people decide they deserve better and refuse to accept anything less. Ronald felt tears forming in his eyes as he listened to Elena articulate truths he was still learning to accept. His transformation hadn't been smooth or easy. Old habits of dominance and control had resurfaced repeatedly, requiring constant vigilance and accountability from others. But the work had been worth it. For the first time in his adult life, Ronald had genuine relationships with employees who respected rather than feared him. He had discovered the satisfaction of using wealth to create opportunities rather than leverage control. Most importantly, he had learned to measure success by how many people he lifted up rather than how many he could push down. As Elena concluded her speech to thunderous applause, she caught Ronald's eye across the auditorium. He nodded slightly, a gesture of gratitude and respect that she returned with a small smile. After the ceremony, they spoke briefly in the university corridor. "Thank you," Ronald said simply, "for refusing to let me continue being the worst version of myself." "Thank you for being willing to do the hard work of change," Elena replied, "and for proving that redemption is possible when someone truly commits to it." Maria, the server whose family emergency had started everything, approached with her son, recovered now and thriving in the university's pre-med program on a scholarship funded by the Ronald Blackwell Foundation for Working Families. "Mr. Blackwell," Maria said, "I wanted you to meet my son Carlos. He's going to be a doctor because you decided that everyone deserves a chance to succeed." Ronald shook the young man's hand, remembering how casually he had once dismissed Maria's family crisis as irrelevant to his convenience. Now, looking at Carlos's bright future, he understood that every employee was someone's child, someone's hope, someone's entire world. As the crowd dispersed, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. A single night of refusing to accept disrespect had rippled outward, creating waves of change that had touched hundreds of lives. Tommy was in college. Frank had his dream restaurant. Isabella was helping workers find justice. Ronald had found his humanity. And Elena had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be small when someone else's ego demands it. The girl who had once cleaned tables while dreaming of justice had become a lawyer, advocate, and inspiration to countless others who are still finding their voices. Sometimes, courage asks everything of us, but it always gives back more than it takes.